A president who won't concede, protests that won't let up, and a pandemic that won't go away. The past 12 months have been plagued by turmoil, from the blast in Beirut to Black lives longing to be heard. Economies are in ruin, nations are at war, and everyone is fighting COVID-19. Was this the worst year ever? I'm Ali Aslan, and today's Newsmaker is the year 2020. How would you describe 2020 in a single word? In a poll by the Guardian newspaper, people's top two answers to that question are words we can't repeat on television. Some of the other words were surreal, apocalyptic, and exhausting. For people across the globe, mass social changes went hand in hand with mass panic as governments and citizens across the world, for a rare moment in history, faced the common enemy. Adam Platz looks back on the year most of us would rather forget.
Time magazine has declared 2020 the worst year ever, or at least the worst in living memory. Its cover echoes past editions, when Adolf Hitler, Saddam Hussein, and Al-Qaeda leaders al-Zarqawi and bin Laden were all crossed out with a red X. Like many years before it, 2020 has seen its fair share of conflicts and protests. From fighting in Azerbaijan and Ethiopia to demonstrations against dozens of governments, as well as widespread calls for racial equality following the killing of George Floyd by a US police officer. Likewise, man-made and natural disasters have taken their toll, including the worst ever recorded fires in Australia and California, often leading to comparisons with the end times.
And it looks like the apocalypse right now.
Crazy. 11:15 in the morning, and it's like the middle of the night almost.
But above all else, it's the coronavirus pandemic that has set the year apart. Many say the Great Depression of the early 1930s and the years during the First or Second World Wars were worse, or for that matter, any year before the discovery of penicillin. But rarely has virtually everybody on the planet faced a common affliction. By December 2020, COVID-19 had taken almost 1.7 million lives and infected at least 75 million people. And the virus has also had a devastating effect on livelihoods. Lockdowns have led the IMF to predict that the global economy will shrink by nearly 5%, the worst decline since the 1930s. Vaccines are now available, but the World Health Organization is urging caution.
Progress on vaccines gives us all a lift, and we can now start to see the light at the end of the tunnel. However, WHO is concerned that there is a growing perception that the pandemic is over. The truth is that at present, many places are witnessing very high transmission of the virus.
And while some countries have begun vaccinating, there is little sign that vaccines will be readily available in poorer nations. As if to underline the fragile victory that humans have wielded over the virus, the UK recently reported a new mutation of COVID-19 that could be 70% more infectious.
Given the early evidence we have on this new variant of the virus, the potential risk it poses, it is with a very heavy heart, I must tell you, we cannot continue with Christmas as planned.
So with the cancellation of end-of-year celebrations in many cities across the world, is it a case of Merry Crisis and a Happy New Fear? Or can things only get better in 2021? Adam Platz, The Newsmakers.
Well, joining me now from London is author Denis MacShane. He's also the UK's former EU minister. In Mexico City, we have political philosopher Brett Evans. He's the curator of the Quarantine Files, Thinkers in Self-Isolation. And in New Delhi is Amit Kapoor, the honorary chairperson of India's Institute for Competitiveness. Brett, was this indeed the worst year ever, as Time magazine has suggested?
Oh, absolutely not. I think we can kind of, get deluded into these kind of grand statements. I think, we only have to look back to 1919, which was far worse in terms of the end of World War I, We have the outbreak of the Spanish flu, which killed some 50 million people. So I think we do need to have a sense of healthy perspective on this. But nevertheless, it was a very devastating year for a lot of people. Part of the problem with these narratives around the worst year ever is it kind of creates a universal kind of condition. But the idea that this was the worst year ever for people like Jeff Bezos clearly isn't the case. So some people do very well in times of crisis, other people less so. So I think these ideas of the worst year ever certainly need to be tempered with a certain critical insight into what that actually means.
And Amit, indeed, I think the generation that went through the Great Depression, World War I or World War II would be offended at the notion that 2020 was the worst year ever. I think the notion is that most of us alive today have seen nothing like this, have we?
Not at all. In fact, but if I have to actually agree with Brad, this is not the worst year ever. The world has seen various pandemics. The plague that actually happened in the 1700s, that was absolutely atrocious. If you really look at 1918 to 1920, followed by 2 world wars and absolute depression, and it was devastating lives. So what we have seen here today is just very small part of the whole large thing that the humanity goes through. In fact, we've actually had years in the preceding 5 or 10 years itself, we've actually had much devastating experiences in singular countries. If you really talk about Sudan, there has been absolute devastation in Sudan that we've actually seen. But if you really look at as a collective, yes, it looks like a bad year, but it is not something that we have not seen as humanity over a large period of time in the history or not, whatever. So if you really look at it, this is just one of the things that has happened. Things can only get better from here. But I think we should not really get into the narrative that this is just going to be spoiling lives, or it is just a devastation for humanity. It is the end all. It is an apocalyptic scenario. The world is going to end. The skies are going to fall. No, we have to live through it. It's an important point in time. It's a learning experience for us. I think it is a great learning experience for all of us at humanity at large, Dennis, rather than saying everything's just going to go off.
Dennis, listening to Brad and Amit, 2020 may just be a drop in a bucket if you look at the bigger picture here and the narrative of world history, of course. But I think it's safe to say that the majority of people are very eager to put this year behind us, no?
It was a bad year, certainly a very bad year for Donald Trump, but the rest of the world absolutely opened the champagne when he left office, or even though he tried to stick around. Yeah, sure. I mean, look, a few people haven't been able to go on 3 holidays this year. A few people haven't been able to play golf this year. There are serious problems. I think it's rather impressive the way science has stepped up to the plate. Doctors have stepped up to the plate. If Donald Trump had actually listened to the doctors and the scientists, maybe he'd still be in power. Who knows? Well, I don't want that. Who knows? Also, governments have changed. They are spending money like nobody spent money before on good things. The US Congress has just voted nearly $1 trillion in recovery money. The European Union has come together with a mammoth trillion euro recovery fund, and there's a real sense we have to do government different and better in the future. So we learn lessons from this. It's a tragedy for the loss of lives, but no, I'm not thinking this is the worst ever year in my lifetime. Far from it.
Brad, as Dennis said, this has certainly not been a good year for Donald Trump. I think it's safe to say that without the pandemic, he would have had a pretty good shot of getting reelected. No, even with the pandemic, it was relatively close, or closer than most people suspected.
Well, it seems to be that was the case with Trump, and there's whether Trump would have won the election were it not for the pandemic is certainly open to question. But obviously, I think that the world is pretty relieved to see perhaps the back of Donald Trump, and it'll actually be a relief not to have to think about him every single day, that we have to kind of think about Donald Trump. But I do also think that there's something being revealed with the loss of the election of Donald Trump, and I think Donald Trump was kind of showing some of the worst excesses of a certain authoritarianism. But actually, he showed also how deeply vulnerable he was in the end, and particularly very vulnerable to the technology firms as well, who he'd almost like served his purpose for them. So I think for Donald Trump also, there's a lesson in global politics actually, where real power actually lies in the world today.
Indeed. Amit, COVID-19 is often described as a global game changer. The defeat of Donald Trump obviously being one of the many examples. Would you concur with that statement?
Oh, yes. I think COVID-19 is a fairly big game changer. In fact, if you really look at the world politics, what we are seeing is that there is seemingly a huge shift in the balance of power. In fact, there is this whole thing that is happening between India, China, Taiwan, Malaysia, wherein we are talking about global value chains, realignment of global value chains. This is also a great point in time when we can see that the authoritarian leaders are getting exposed. And when you talk about authoritarian leaders getting exposed or the populist leaders getting exposed, we can actually see that the democracy is going to function better over a period of time. The loss of Donald Trump in the US is a great reflection that if you do not take care of your people, then you are actually going to get thrown out in a democratic process. Even though the election was very close, we cannot debate that fact. But at the end of the day, people were really getting sick of how things were actually panning out and so on and so forth. But at the end of the day, this is also a very important point in time from a capitalistic viewpoint, because this is when people have to go deeper and understand that capitalism will have to get redefined for the future. Because if we don't do that, we are actually going to have turmoil of a very different nature, because it's actually about disparity in the world, which has also come at the forefront. And that is where things like the whole humanitarian issue of Black lives, etc., which have actually come to the fore. So it is more embedded in disparity than anything else.
Before we get into the aspect of capitalism, let me pick on the stuff that you said about the protests worldwide. And indeed, Denis, we've seen an unusual number of protests this year, haven't we? BLM, Thailand, Nigeria, Zimbabwe, Belarus, Kyrgyzstan, just to name a few of worldwide protests of people rising up against their government this year. Do you think there's a narrative? Obviously, they all have different perspectives, different circumstances, but do you think there's a constant denominator here?
Absolutely. And the constant denominator is that too many of the elected politicians we have get into power and then give up. They start lining their own pockets, they start helping their own families, they start developing populist themes, identity themes, often racist themes. You know, Mr. Modi doesn't like Muslims, and Mr. Bolsonaro doesn't like gays, and Mr. Orban doesn't like Jews in Hungary. And people do rise up and react against it. And I'm very impressed by the fact the United States, with all its flaws, still the real pumping heart of democracy, was able to get rid of a populist leader. And if I was president, it can't happen in China. It can't happen in a number of other countries. It's very hard to imagine it happening in Italy, dare I say it, in Turkey. But you can feel the rumbling that too many of these men have stayed in power maybe a bit too long, and things are moving. In Europe, we've seen some dramatic increases in support for the Green parties, more progressive parties, the hard right-wing racist parties have been pushed back in. Seen football in England embracing Black Lives Matter. We're seeing people taking the knee. We're seeing a match between a Turkish team and Paris Saint-Germain being stopped because one of the Turkish players was insulted going onto the pitch. And that was a wonderful moment for football, to stop putting up with racist insults. So, you know, I'm sorry, I don't want to be, you know, the world's going in a good direction, but I think some of these uprising and protest movements are sending very clear signals that we need a new politics.
Brad, would you concur that the pandemic, for all its obviously grief that it has bestowed upon the world, has also brought upon a new spirit on the part of the average citizen, not being able and willing to suffer those injustices anymore?
Well, I think if there is a good story and a good lesson from history, is that people do resist what they find patently intolerable. And I think you talk about a common denominator for all these protests. I think while, of course, you know, I agree with Denis that there's been a pernicious identity politics which has really crept into a certain populism, which has been, you know, really divisive for the world. And you can see the natural reactions to this. Also, we can't get away from, to me, the overriding common denominator in all this is poverty, and people facing real stark conditions of poverty where governments fail them. And I don't just mean economic poverty, I mean life poverty, you know, the poverty that comes from not having healthcare systems that will be robust enough to simply protect people. And I think this response that we see into this, then, I don't think it can be simply reduced to a single narrative of race or a single narrative of identity. It's a much broader sense of global injustice. And people do constantly then will fight what's intolerable. And if there's one thing we can take from humans historically, optimistically, is people won't stand for oppression over the long run. And actually, these populist governments actually show themselves to be very fragile. That's the good story, I think, always. The fascism is always very fragile. Populism is always very fragile. So people can resist and make actual serious political change if, of course, they're mobilized enough.
So the pandemic can act as a wake-up call in a sense, says Brad. But Amit, interestingly enough, poverty has been mentioned, the gap between rich and poor have been mentioned. You have questioned and offered the notion that capitalism itself might be rethought. But the richest men on earth have amassed even greater wealth during this pandemic. Someone like Jeff Bezos' wealth has quadrupled, is now close to $200 billion now. That is a trend that cannot be healthy, can it?
Oh, definitely not. I don't think that trend is healthy at all. In fact, if you really look at the numbers, the what I call difference between the rich and the poor has actually been rising in the last 40 years. The best period in the history of the world was something like, or at least in the American capitalistic history, was 1945 until 1975. That's when the disparities were the lowest. It was a very open society. It was a society where, when the Woodstock happened, people were courageous enough and they were actually on some kind of a situation where they were rebellious. But now suddenly what you're seeing is that you have this disparity which is rising hugely, and that is causing a lot of anxiety. In fact, there have been questions on the salaries for the CEOs to what is the kind of profit that needs to happen. So there has to be a model wherein we have to understand that the social objectives and economic objectives will have to come together for the world. If we don't do that, we are actually going to be talking about huge sets of issues from politics point of view, because politics of the future will have to understand that we have to bring these objectives together. Capitalists will have to understand, or enterprises will have to understand. What is happening with Jeff Bezos is something huge. In fact, whether he actually gives away his wealth to a better cause, or should he actually do that or not, is a very large question to answer. But at the end of the day, I think corporations per se will have to change themselves over a period of time, or else people will revolt against the very model of capitalism that we are actually seeing right now. We have seen those sets of things happen in the US, in Europe, in India. There is that resentment between the enterprises and the people who are actually there. And it is happening because the disparities are rising. In fact, the salaries or the top end of the world, the top 1% grew by about 180% in the last 30 years. And their wealth grew by that percent. But if you really look at the bottom 50%, they just grew by about 25%. So there is a huge disparity that happened, and we need to solve that problem. And that's a problem of the world, and that's a capitalistic problem that we are looking at. We don't have to go back to socialistic systems. What I'm saying is, get your model right.
And Dennis, the economic problems might grow even worse next year. There's a lot of borrowing, obviously, that we're seeing on the part of governments. We're expecting a lot of bankruptcies to be filed in the coming year, especially now if this coronavirus crisis is going on as long as it has. Do you think we're in for a rude awakening economically next year?
Well, interest rates are very low, which helps governments a lot to borrow, and the private sector as well. But you can't really see the huge layoffs. London, from where I'm speaking, as you all know, is in complete lockdown. India has banned all flights from London. Turkey's banned all flights. France has banned all lorry crossings, which is a bit worrying, as 80% of our fresh fruit and vegetable arrives from other European countries. But this is going to now possibly last until April. And that really is an enormous number of jobs. Small firms, little takeaway food shops, cafes, restaurants, now be unable to operate. The extent to which the government can keep paying for those to stay alive is hard to see going forward for more than, perhaps we can do it for another 6 months or a year. But after that, we are into very big crisis territory. So speed up the vaccination program, speed up the testing program, speed up the discipline, because it's quite extraordinary in this country. I only speak for dear old Britain, which loves queuing. We hate queuing now. We're fighting to get into pubs, fighting to breathe into each other's faces, and then fighting to try and get into the hospitals when our old folk die because we've been so stupid.
And Brad, so not in the short term, says Dennis. In the short term, he doesn't expect the global economy to take a nosedive because of Corona. What's your take?
I think in terms of, first of all, you look at the situation, particularly in the UK, but rest across Europe, there's certain sectors, again, I don't think this is kind of a universal narrative. There's certain sectors which are clearly being decimated. The hospitality sector is pretty much on its knees, and how that even begins to recover really needs a very coordinated, serious government strategy, and also an ethical strategy from people once the economy gets back up and running. But I think there's a much broader question here, which goes back to the previous question around, the winners of this new global economy are the powers of the global tech firms. And it's not just simply enough to ask Jeff Bezos to give a bit more money to help with social infrastructure projects or healthcare projects. We need to understand that these new winners of the global system is where real power lies, and we need to have a much more serious understanding of what a political response to this kind of power and profit means in the 21st century, because it is power and it is profit. And I think this is where we need to have a much more serious realignment in our understanding of global political economy.
Amit, looking ahead, soon 2021 is falling upon us. Are you hopeful for the year to come after 2020? A lot of people say can't get any worse. Are you optimistic as far as the next year is concerned?
Oh, yeah. Absolutely. Absolutely optimistic. In fact, if you really look at it, and the reason for optimism is the vaccine is just there. We know that there are a couple of vaccines which have actually got approved. It is actually going to start a very interesting process of recovery. People will be able to get back to their normal lives. But this is also going to have a huge impact on the economic upliftment of the world, because that is when the economy will kickstart. Now, of course, there are sectors which have got decimated and so forth, but the economy will move ahead. And that is what is going to be a very big positive. We are already seeing that kind of positive impact in India. We've had huge devastation because of the pandemic, but I think what we are seeing is that there are those green shoots that have actually emerged. There are a positive impact on economy that is already happening. And that is going to happen across the world. We might actually end up seeing a V-shaped recovery or a U-shaped recovery in economic terms across the world. And it is going to be a positive 2021. Huge opportunities somewhere in the second, third quarter of the next year. And that's what I'm actually looking forward to.
So Amit is looking forward to 2021. How about yourself, Dennis? Obviously, Brexit is one of the issues that we thought we put behind us. With 2020, doesn't look that way, does it?
Certainly not. We are beginning the era of what I call Brexiternity. It's going to last an eternity. There's a mini deal that covers just trade in hard goods and food. Everything else that Britain makes its money from, we've got no access to the single market. We're going to have to be negotiating endless deals over the next 10, 20, 30 years with our partners in Europe. It's an insane proposition of Brexit. But around the world, too, I still see so many tensions. Look at China. No democracy, no freedom of expression. We don't know actually what happened in Wuhan last fall into the beginning of December when the pandemic exploded. And look at the problems between Pakistan and India. Look at the whole anger that the world's Muslim population feels, including in this country, about what it sees as its unfair place in the world. So many of the poorest, the most corrupt governments in the world are in majority Muslim countries. And you see this hate campaign against Muslims from Donald Trump, forgive me if I say it, but also in India at times and in my own country. So we've got to solve those difficulties as well, because when faith combines with political passion and poverty, that is an absolutely explosive cocktail. And I don't really think we've got the quality of leadership. Here in Europe, an interesting statistic, European population has been declining since 2012. More of us are dying than are being born in Europe. The German population went down by 40,000 in the first 6 months of this year. So how does Europe fill its population gap? Because there'll be no more young people being born in Europe to look after me when I get old. Well, perhaps I'm old already, but do the necessary work, serve in the cafes, work in the hospitals. So that's a big question Europe has to face.
So certainly many of the challenges of 2020 will remain in 2021. Before we go, we're about to wrap up. Brett, let me get your take on 2021 as well. How hopeful are you that next year is going to be better than this year?
Well, I think I'm just notoriously pessimistic, but I look at the world going forward, and I think, I think Dennis is right. The world never seems more divided, and I think if we talk about the worst year ever, perhaps one of the worst years ever is because of just political ineptitude, and we can only hope that going forward we will have the courage to develop a better political imagination, which can overcome so much of the divisive politics the world encounters right now. So I guess I'm cautiously optimistic that perhaps it can't get worse on a health front, but certainly going forward, there's a lot of great significant challenges, and we need to really rethink what politics might mean in the 21st century.
2020 may not have been the worst year of our lifetime or ever, but certainly I think we can agree we're all eager to turn the page. Brad Evans, Amit Kapoor, and Denis MacShane, thank you so much. Well, thanks for watching, and hope to see you again next time.